on day 2 of our sourdough starter. I have the 2 jars. I'm going to show you the difference between which one was thick, which one was thin. This jar right here was the thinner jar, and this was the thicker jar. This one I've kept, I'll show you. I've sat it on the edge of the Hoosier, which is right next to the wood stove, which means that it had a heat source, not a direct heat source, but it would be like sitting it near a heater vent in your home. Not directly in front of, but close enough that it's going to get a little extra heat. You know, some of the propane stoves used to have pilot lights, so you would get the same effect if you were to set your sourdough, if you were trying to get it activated quickly on top of your propane stove if you have the older style, so that pilot light is warming up your sourdough. Also, possibly, if your oven has a pilot light, you could consider putting it inside that, with it off, of course, overnight to help activate your sourdough. Okay, so let's get a good look at what we're looking at. All right, so I'm going to turn my light on here and see if we can't get a closer look at the aeration. Now, again, the coloration of my yeast is probably going to be different than many of yours, unless you're using whole wheat. If you're just using a white flour, your yeast batch is not going to look dark like this. But you're looking for the aeration. You can see the air bubbles in there. It's doing what it's supposed to do. I have used my yeast when I've been in need this quickly when starting a batch of sourdough. It is not necessarily the preferred way to do it because it's the aging of the sourdough that gives the sourdough time for the good bacteria to multiply, gives the natural yeast the ability to get the flavors, as well as it does work better when it's allowed to sit and ferment properly. But it can work like at this stage. All right, so here's the second one that's a little bit heavier. It was the more pasty looking starter that we did. This did not sit near a heat source. It has not risen. You can see the difference here. It has not risen quite as much. It might not have been equally amounts either, but it doesn't have the aeration that this one does. You can see on this one that was thinner, it has quite a bit of aeration going on there throughout the side of the starter. On this one, there's a little bit aeration, but it's a little bit more denser. Again, because of the density and the fact that it was not near heat. This liquid here is fine. In fact, that liquid is very common. It's a separation from the wheat and the liquid. At one time, and we're gonna discuss this further, but that if your sourdough needs to be fed, you're going to get a thicker layer of liquid, and that's usually a good cue for you to pay attention if you aren't using your sourdough, to be alert when it's time to feed it. If you're using your sourdough regularly, you're feeding it enough. It's not an issue. We're going to feed it today. For me, I'm going to use a cup, 2 cups of flour, and it just depends. It depends what I'm after. I have enough starter in here that 2 cups would be warranted. Usually if you're using less than this, 1 cup is fine. And then you're going to use the water to get the consistency that we showed yesterday, either thick or thinner. If you should do anything where you think you've added too much water, then just add a little bit more flour. Again, you don't want your dough, your starter so thin that it's like pouring a very thin batter, and you don't want it so pasty that it's like already like a biscuit form. So, but don't be afraid to play with it a little bit. Okay, so I'm just putting the flour in. I'm going to do 2 cups per jar. On this one, my pastier starter, so I'll make sure I don't use as much water. All right, so now one thing when I do this, because like I said, the batter does thin out as it sits. The aeration, the microbes working, all that good stuff. It changes the consistency. So when I add flour for additional feedings, I will start to stir as soon as I start adding the liquid. All right, and this was the thinner one, and I'm gonna hold that up so you can see. And see, it's kind of stretchy, which is what you want. That's what the yeast is doing. It's doing its job, making that stuff a little bit stretchier. All right, now here's the more pastier one. It's so pasty that I couldn't stir it without adding liquid first. Now, there's all types of, instructions. You'll find a 50 ratio. You'll find a quarter to 2/3. There's really no right or wrong with this. Just find out what works for you. All of our home environments are different. Our locations, our altitudes, humidities. You've just really got to work with this. Now see how much thicker that is? And I'm going to leave it because I'm not in a rush to use this one. And I just want you guys to see that it'll still do its thing. And that's primarily so if you think you've done it wrong or you think you don't have the exact amounts, you're going to see that it still works. Okay, so that's it for today. We will check back in tomorrow, take a look at what it's looking like, show you the aeration, and we will probably actually even use the thinner one to make a batch of bread tomorrow. I was going to make it today, but I ran out of time. Otherwise, I actually would use it today. Some reasons why you lose sourdough. If you have a refrigerator, you're good. The chances of you having to worry about losing it are so thin. It's just not even enough to worry about. But if you're keeping your sourdough at room temperature, there's all types of things to consider. Our hardest time for us is during the warmer months. I have several things that I have to keep track of. One thing is gnats. Gnats are notorious, even if you have a cupboard. And of course, you can't put a tight lid on it because then as it needs to breathe, you could have a real mess. So you have to have a lid that just sets there, basically. You can put cheesecloth on, put a rubber band around it. I've done that before. I still have gnats get in it. So I've had it in cupboards. They usually fare better when I put it in cupboards, and I've done that this summer, and I still lost a batch to a gnat, flying in. Think of like bananas. Whenever you have bananas on your counter, gnats somehow miraculously just appear out of nowhere. The other thing that is definitely a hazard, and I want you to keep this in mind because it's really important. All right, note right here. See this buildup? And I'm really bad at this. When I'm stirring, I take my spoon and I wipe it on the side like that. That is okay to do as long as you go back and wipe that off, because what happens, especially if you're not refrigerating, you will end up, if your environment's just right, you'll get mold, hairy mold there, and you end up ruining your sourdough. So I recommend changing your jar, wiping your jar when you add to it, but changing it every so often just to decrease the chances of that. I've had sourdough for a really long time on my counter, not refrigerated, and it's been fine. But then there are just those chances where all of the things work together and create problems. So this summer was really bad. I lost 3 or 4 batches of sourdough, and I've never lost that many before in one summer. In fact, there's been several summers where I've made it through without any issue. So, all right, we will see you guys tomorrow and check in on the sourdough. If you have started one with us, let us know in the comment section below if you've decided to go along with us and do this, and tell us what you're thinking if this is your first time. We'll talk soon. God bless.